Greece right now is in a terrible financial situation. They owe over $300 billion collectively to the International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank, and many other countries inside the Eurozone of the European Union: France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, just to name a few. The Eurozone is obviously the collection of countries inside the EU that uses the euro as its official currency. So today, I want to break down just how Greece got into this debt crisis, where the blame lies, how Greece can then fix it, and what this means for the rest of the world. Let us begin. So Greece's terrible situation began when its government spending went on the uptick in the 1970s. This increase in spending largely went to the military, public sector jobs, pensions, and social programs. The problem with this uptick in government spending was that Greece did not have as much money coming in to supplement all of that spending. There were, of course, mainly taxes. This creates a budget deficit. Now, many countries around the world have deficits. Here in the United States, we are certainly not an exception, with over $400 billion worth of one. However, countries need to fill in this hole in their finances some sort of way. And Greece, like many other countries, filled it by simply borrowing from neighboring countries. However, this cycle of overspending and then borrowing more money to support it became extremely unhealthy when the Great Recession rolled around, because all of the neighboring countries that Greece relied on to borrow money from, they no longer had much money themselves. These problems were only worsened when Greece's economy itself took a major hit. The country's two largest industries, tourism and shopping, were completely ravaged by the recession, with their revenues falling by 15% in just 2009. This means that the little money Greece had left to back up this overspending and overborrowing was terribly depleted during the recession, this money being tax revenue. So not only did the lenders stop lending, but there was no longer as much tax revenue to back up the overspending and overborrowing either. This was terrible for Greece, because as all of the spending continued to add up, they were no longer able to pay money back to the countries that had lent to them in the first place to back up this spending, and they were no longer able to afford the spending because of that. This racks up the debt because they can no longer pay the money back, and this racks up the deficit because Greece can obviously no longer afford to spend. Now naturally, Greece had to lower the amount of money it spent, or else its debt and deficit would continue to exponentially climb. Now, another huge reason why Greece's debt and deficit continued to increase was widespread tax evasion and corruption. In the last quarter of 2005, 49% of all companies inspected by tax authorities in Greece were found to have committed some form of tax offense. And researchers at the University of Chicago concluded that in 2009, just self-employed workers alone in Greece, meaning people like doctors, lawyers, dentists, accountants, they committed 28 billion euros worth of tax fraud. This figure was 31% of Greece's budget deficits. This means that if just the self-employed workers in Greece alone had paid their taxes like they were supposed to, nearly a third of the deficit I talked about in Greece, it would have been gone. Man. Now, a couple more statistics about tax evasion in Greece. The Tax Justice Network estimates that there are over 20 billion euros owned by Greeks sitting in Swiss bank accounts. Now, why is that important? Under Swiss law, bankers cannot tell anybody about the existence of your account without the person who owns that account's permission. And you don't even have to attach a name to that account in the first place. Therefore, if Greece wants to collect your money for taxes, if you want to get out of paying taxes, all you have to do is simply store that money away in a fancy Swiss bank account. And Greece can't touch it. Now, one final statistic. Again, according to the Tax Justice Network, there are over 10,000 Greek-owned offshore companies, meaning even though that company is based in Greece, they're simply placing the money they make overseas, automatically taking it out of Greece's jurisdiction, and again, Greece can't touch it. This is systematic corruption and abuse, and it played a major role in the creation of Greece's debt crisis. Now, without the tax money they needed to back up their spending, Greece was absolutely screwed, and they had to supplement from some other source by borrowing, therefore racking up the debt. Even if they were spending conservatively, which they weren't, they couldn't have had enough money to back it up because all of the tax money Greece should be taking in was now gone. Now, all of Greece's economic prospects started to tumble again right when in 2009, Greece reported that it had underwritten its deficit levels for years. Right away, all confidence in the Greece economy was revoked, and therefore Greece could no longer borrow inside the financial markets. Greece would soon really need to borrow some money right when the Great Recession hit. In 2010, Greece began to sharply cut government spending because of its terrible debt and deficit levels, just as the global recession reached Greece. The country simply could not recover in time to save its economy. Unemployment levels quickly rose, wages plummeted. It was a disaster for the Greek economy. Because Greece could no longer borrow inside the financial markets, there was no support provided for an economy that desperately needed it. So, help finally came, luckily for Greece, when in late 2010, the EU granted an emergency bailout to Greece. And this is where the main story begins. Now, with this 240 billion euro bailout from the EU and the IMF came an extremely harsh austerity package tied to it. There were deep budget cuts, mountainously steep tax increases, and unprecedented plans to merge and cut government agencies to save spending. Now, this is a very unhealthy response to an economy in need, because austerity in many cases not only stagnates your economy, but kills your economy. And during a recession, your economy needs life. It needs some sort of spark, not policies that are going to limit growth. But instead of lowering taxes and raising spending to revitalize the economy, the EU decided at the exact wrong time to raise taxes and cut spending. This meant all the government programs and assistance Greece needed to help its economy were gone. Its people were unnecessarily robbed of its money thanks to tax increases. Now, some of you guys might be saying over there, but didn't you just spend a few minutes talking about how Greece had too much debt and too large of a deficit? Therefore, wasn't austerity needed to cut debt and cut the deficit? Yes, but in different economic conditions. If the economy is doing fairly well and your government is still overspending and borrowing too much money to supplement that spending, yes, you need to go ahead and cut government spending and raise taxes to lower the debt and deficit levels to bring some stability back into the economy. However, when the government raises taxes on people who are struggling and cuts spending that needs to be going towards reviving your economy, it's a recipe for disaster. And disaster certainly occurred because of it. Unemployment rose to over 25%, and the wages of the Greeks, already steadily decreasing, dropped 20% from 2010 to 2014. The economy, which the EU already projected would contract, but only 5.5%, contracted over a quarter since the austerity measures were implemented. And as you can see, all of Greece's terrible deficiencies inside of its system that came back to haunt them. The overspending, the overborrowing, the tax evasion. There was no money left when the Greek people were in trouble and needed help. Because of it, the Greek government had to run to the EU central powers for help. And instead of policies that were going to help their economy, the EU's austerity only compounded their troubles. So where does the blame lie? Of course, some of it lies on the Greeks for putting themselves in this mess in the first place. But blame also lies on the shoulders of the EU. The EU took a chance on Greece. It was an economic experiment. Austerity has historically been unsuccessful in reviving economies, and in this situation it was no different. The EU projected, even the EU who actually put these measures in place, they projected themselves that when they put these measures in place, that the economy would contract and unemployment would rise. They knew that this situation would be disastrous for the Greek economy, but they demanded Greece implement these measures anyway. That was a terrible decision by the EU, and something the Greek people have been paying for and will continue to pay for years to come. Now, because these austerity measures only destroyed the Greek economy even more, when the time came for Greece to pay these huge bailout loans back, they simply did not have the money. And that time is now. Greece already missed a payment to the IMF at the end of June, and Greece could potentially miss a payment to the EU towards the end of July. And if they do so, many economists believe that Greece could be booted out of the euro. Now, for the sake of the global economy, Greece and the EU are both currently trying to prevent that situation from ever occurring. The global economy is very fragile, and we do not need any type of disturbance. Now, at the beginning of the week, the EU gave Greece a Sunday deadline to reach a bailout agreement. This coming after Greece held a referendum on the EU's proposal of another bailout with more terrible austerity attached to it. The Greek people understandably voted a resounding no to this proposal, with 60% of the voters coming out against it. However, it seems that the Greek government has relented and has submitted a proposal to the EU that includes more of this disastrous austerity in return for billions in bailout money and a write-off of a significant portion of Greece's debt. Now, more specifics on Greece's proposal. Greece would be forced to implement 13 billion euros worth of public spending cuts. The country would also be forced to implement drastic increases to its sales tax. More Greek industries would be subject to the country's top tax rate of 23%, including now restaurants. The corporate tax rate would be raised to 28%. The retirement age would be raised to 67 years by 2022, and Greece would have to phase out solidarity payments for its poorest pension earners by December 2019, a year earlier than planned. So these are all major concessions to the EU, and a relatively severe austerity package that Greece would be forced to implement. Because understand, Greece's total government spending in 2014 was around 120 billion euros. A 13 billion euro cut to spending is huge. That's over a 10% cut to all government operations. That is just titanic, it's gigantic, especially for a national government. This puts the entire economy on hold, as the government, who is supposed to provide social programs that support the economy, now can no longer fully fund those programs. The sales tax would also be significantly raised, and don't forget, that adds up for the average Joe over the course of a year. The retirement age will be raised to 67. Now this is huge. The average Greek man retires at 63, and the average Greek woman at 59. That is years and years without any type of benefits, and that is disastrous for a group of people who no longer work, obviously. These are all huge impacts that Greece has already tried and failed at, thanks to the EU. Of course, Greece's overspending and overborrowing helped cause this crisis, but the EU only worsened the issue. And what does Greece get in return for the EU's austerity? A 53 billion euro bailout program over 3 years that historically goes to the international banks to pay back loans and not into the economy. Greece has officially given up. Straight up. And it's pretty darn sad to see a country be forced to go through the same path of treachery that placed them in a terrible predicament in the first place. Because it's not only going to compound these problems. Now, Greece's solution to these problems should be very simple. Lower taxes on average Greek workers and small businesses. Increase taxes on the rich. And this proposal, the corporate tax rate is raised as well, so that's one of the only positives inside it. Yes, you need to raise the corporate tax rate. Greece needs to modernize their tax code and tax system to ensure no money is offshored or hidden. And with the extra infusion of cash Greece will receive, they need to gear their money towards educating their people. Because with education comes a newly prepared workforce that can succeed in a global economy. Now, in the meantime, Greece has to renegotiate its bailout program so that much of its debt is written off. Luckily, some of it is in this proposal. Or, if you can't even do that, at least extend it over a longer period of time, allowing Greece to incrementally pay it off at a healthier rate. There won't be an immediate miracle, of course, but eventually, I guarantee you, if Greece does this, their economy will grow and prosper. However, if they continue with these disastrous austerity policies, they will suffer. Mark my words. It has happened historically, and it will continue. Now, Greece took a major step in the wrong direction today by submitting this type of proposal and making huge concessions to the EU. Greece must renegotiate their bailouts to exclude any remnants of austerity. If not, it's over. Now, Greece has, of course, already been trying to do this, and this is where Greece's other debt-ridden European neighbors come in. Greece has to find support with other European nations who are in similar situations as Greece in terms of their huge debt crisis. Countries such as Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, countries that are riddled by their debts and were hit extremely hard by the recession. They're frustrated with the EU as well, and if Greece can turn that frustration into an anti-austerity push, they have something. Otherwise, Greece either exits the euro and causes a huge calamity inside the global markets, or they continue with their horrible austerity measures. Neither of those options sound very favorable, and there is support. There really is. There are only a few countries inside the EU that are actually pushing these austerity policies, mainly Germany. However, those few countries are the ones with the most power inside the EU. But if you can alienate those few countries from the rest of the EU, then they will be pressured into ending these terrible austerity policies. Otherwise, Greece is going to continue to suffer. Now, why does this matter? Understand, this is the same fight we're fighting over here. Right-wing policies that simply do not work. Drastic spending cuts, huge tax increases on people who are already being squeezed. They're policies that simply do not work, and they're being implemented in some form or another across the globe. But if we can win the austerity fight in Europe, and if progressives can gain control here in America with Bernie, the progressive revolution wins in two key parts of the world, and that matters. But also don't forget, if Greece exits the euro, many economists believe that it could trigger a major economic shakeup. But progressives winning in Europe matters, because it becomes easier for liberal values to prevail across the globe. So join the growing anti-austerity movement sweeping across the globe, because if we win in Europe, mark my words, my progressive heroes, we can win anywhere.